might not resonate for you, but I like the meaning of this, so I'm going to play this for you.
Always remember this one. When a human being truly loves you, their biggest fear is to hurt you. But when a human being is in love with how you make them feel, their biggest fear is to lose you. And then there is you, and understanding the difference.
Okay, so what she's saying in there is that love is about caring more about the well-being of the person that you love than about the way that person makes you feel. That's selfish. That's loving yourself more than the other person. When somebody else makes you feel good about yourself and you're afraid to lose that person, that's not love. And it's important to understand when you define love that way as caring for the well-being of another person, it's going to make a lot of sense putting this question into context here. So let's look at the question. All right. So the question again was, John's niece and nephew, who he was taking care of, essentially testified against you in the trial. How hard was that? It seems like such a benign question. And this question doesn't answer the question of, did you murder John O'Keefe? But this gives us such a pivotal piece of information here. Let me show you.
John's niece and nephew, who he was taking care of, essentially testified against you in the trial. How hard was that?
I knew that was coming because I read what they testified to in the initial indictment almost 3 years ago. And they're part of a well that was poisoned almost as soon as he died. And they were 3 years younger then and impressionable and surrounded by adults that care for them and provide for them. And I was no longer one of those adults. And it's unfortunate, and I hope and wish for the best for them, but I've long come to terms with what's happened to the children.
I knew that was coming because I read what they testified to in the initial indictment almost 3 years ago. Okay, there's a lot of sensitivity here. Deception. She says she knew what was coming. Now, because this is deceptive, I can tell you she didn't know what was coming. She did read it, but she had no idea what was coming. Maybe because she felt like even though they said that behind closed doors, that when it came time to show up in court, she was expecting them to reflect the relationship that they had. And she was clearly tore up about that. So she's pretending like she's strong and she was prepared for this, but you're going to see here that this destroyed her. So she wasn't prepared for it. What they testified to in the initial indictment almost 3 years ago, and they're part of a well that was poisoned almost as soon as he died. Okay, that's direct and straightforward, truthful. And they were 3 years younger then and impressionable and surrounded by adults that care for them and provide for them. And I was no longer one of those adults. That's all direct. So you see the deception in the beginning, and you see what that deception tells you is how much pain she went through hearing their testimony. And it's unfortunate. So that's interesting because you think that she's referring to the testimony, but she's referring to the sentence right before it. And I was no longer one of those adults, and it's unfortunate. So you see her reflecting, and while the insinuation is that the well being poisoned is what was unfortunate, the testimony was unfortunate, it was unfortunate, but you see she stumbles on it's because it refers not just to what she's insinuating, but I was no longer one of those adults. And it's unfortunate, meaning she had a very strong tie to those kids. And I hope and wish the best for them. So that's not deception. I with Karen Reed, especially because she does it a lot. That's very high sensitivity. I hope and wish for the best for them. This is a struggle for her. And I've long come to terms with what's happened to the children. I have. That's a repeating pronoun here along with the verb. So I have long come to terms with what's happened to the children. She has not come to terms with that. So this is a statement that really gives you a glimpse into what ties all of this together. The love that Karen Reed had that created all of this guilt was for the kids, not for John O'Keefe. She's tore up here, and it comes across very clearly in her answer. And so now you can fit all the puzzle pieces together. In fact, let's begin that process. Let's take everything that we've learned. That's the last question we're going to look at. So let's recap this so that we have a very clear idea of what we know about Karen Reed here. Karen Reed wants to portray an image of strength, but in reality, she has been deeply hurt throughout this entire process, mainly by the children turning against her, but also by negativity from the public. We learned that because of the indicators of deception when she was trying to put a strong foot forward. Karen Reed loved the children, not John O'Keefe. Okay, we got that from the last question. Karen Reed made poor decisions regarding how much she drank that night, and that still haunts her as being a bad decision. We know that the scientific evidence of Karen Reed not hitting John O'Keefe is clear because of the federal investigators from the ARCA investigation that was withheld from the first trial. We know that Karen Reed's vehicle did not hit John O'Keefe, and John O'Keefe wasn't hit by a vehicle. We know that Karen Reed felt responsible for John O'Keefe's death for at least the first 3 or 4 days. She told you that. Her perception was that it must have been her. There's a couple of things that go into that. That number one, she doesn't say that she thought she hit him. She says she thought that that was the most likely scenario. And that's because of how much she drank, that she didn't actually remember that very well. And so she feels that even though she didn't hit John O'Keefe and she's not in any way responsible for his death, due to the state that she was in that night and the decisions that she made, it could just as easily have been her fault. That's important. She dodged a bullet, so to speak. For someone like Karen Reed, who, I mean, if you look at her background, the job that she has, the education that she has, the way she tries to present herself, portraying herself as a responsible adult, as a responsible individual is very important to Karen Reed. The way Karen Reed is perceived by people around her is very important to her. She wants to be responsible. She wants people to look up to her. She's educated. She had a good job. All that stuff is very important to her. So when she looks back on that evening and thinks, wow, I made a bad decision with how much I drank and then drove, got in the car, put myself into a situation where that could have just as easily been my fault. That's the bottom line, is that it wasn't her fault, but she feels like it could have been. In fact, for 4 days, she felt that it was her fault, only because she underestimated the nefarious personalities of the people around her. But the idea in her mind that she'd made a series of decisions, that she was one of those people that make those types of bad decisions, that put her into a situation where it could have been. If he hadn't been murdered, if he had walked behind or in front of her SUV, she could have been the one that ran over him and not even known it because of the state she was in. That is weighing on her. That is heavy on her mind. So Karen Reed is logically very clear on what happened that night. She's been studying it for 3 years. Why is she studying it so hard? Because she's trying to prove to herself that she didn't hit him. And it's very clear. There's a ton of physical evidence that says she didn't do it. There's a ton of witness testimony from the witnesses that testified against her that they did do it. So she has a very clear storyline laid out in front of her of what actually happened. The problem is that she doesn't really remember it all that well. What's weighing on her mind is the bad decisions that she made that night. Okay, so my personal opinion, based on all the evidence, based on all the testimony, based on all the analysis, what do I think happened? Karen Reed didn't hit John O'Keefe. She knows that logically, and all of the evidence supports that. However, she made bad decisions that night, and those bad decisions caused her to put herself into a situation where she was not the responsible adult in the room. And that grinds against everything that is important to her. Also, she feels that if she had made the responsible decision to tell John O'Keefe, you're going home tonight. I don't care if this ends our relationship. You're going home tonight. You're not going out with them, no matter how badly you want to go out with them. She could have made the decision to drive home. She could have made the decision not to go out that night. There's a lot of decisions she could have made that would have prevented all of this. And in the end, I think that what she feels the most guilt about and the most responsibility for is the life that John O'Keefe's niece and nephew are going to live now without parents and without their uncle and without her. I think she felt that she was the only responsible person that was mothering them. That is what creates this intense sense of guilt and feeling responsible for this. And it's going to be hard for anybody to convince her otherwise, because while John O'Keefe is at rest now, his niece and nephew are not. They're continuing to suffer. And I think that weighs on Karen Reed. So that is my analysis. Let me know what you think. There's a lot to take in here, but I think that once you understand the deception, the indicators of truth, the story and the evidence, and put everything together, in the end, what this tells you is that Karen Reed is not the main character in this story. If the main character that we're talking about is the villain, then the main character is we're yet to get a trial on that. The last thing I want to say is what the Commonwealth is doing to Karen Reed, clearly knowing they have the evidence. They they have decided for some reason to persecute her, knowing that she didn't do it, it's either lazy or malicious. But either way, to make the conscious decision to destroy the life of somebody who's already suffering from this is insane. It doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, other than protecting their own, which if a person decides they're going to protect their own, they'll go to the grave to do that. But I don't know, the damage that they're doing in order to try to cover this up. I can care and read through this emotional turmoil. I mean, if I was doing that to somebody when I was working, that would have been considered torture. But for some reason, they seem to be getting away with it. But that's it. That's my personal opinion that I added on to the very end there. But, I feel like I've earned it after doing all the analysis.